One, the boy shaped by war long before he became the legendary King Edward I. The boy who would one day reshape Britain was born into a world already trembling under the weight of endless violence. Edward entered life on June 17th, 1239, in the Palace of Westminster, a child destined not for peace, but for battle. His father, King Henry III, was a gentle, indecisive ruler, constantly challenged by rebellious barons. From Edward's earliest memories, the halls of the palace were filled not with laughter, but with arguments, threats, and frantic councils. Edward grew up watching his father begged for loyalty from men who didn't fear him. To the young prince, this weakness planted a seed, a belief that a king must be feared to be respected. He listened as nobles whispered about overthrowing Henry, watched his mother, Queen Eleanor, struggle to defend the family name, and learned early that a crown was not a symbol of glory. It was a target. Even as a child, Edward towered over others his age. His extraordinary height would later earn him the name Longshanks. He trained relentlessly in swordplay, archery, and horsemanship, partly because he enjoyed it, and partly because he understood he might one day need those skills to keep the throne. He did not crave comfort, he craved strength. At 12, Edward witnessed his first political crisis, the barons demanding that his father surrendered much of his royal authority. The prince watched in silence, but the anger carved into his face was unmistakable. He swore quietly that no one would ever force him to kneel the way his father did. The crown, he decided, must control the land, not the other way around. By adolescence, Edward was already studying the tactics of William the Conqueror, the discipline of Roman legions, and the legends of Arthurian kings. His tutors marveled at his intensity. He wasn't just learning history, he was preparing for the wars he believed he was destined to fight. As he grew older, the political storms around him only intensified. Noble families schemed against one another. The powerful de Montfort family rose as a major threat. England seemed ready to split apart. Edward, barely a man, found himself pulled into the center of the struggle. At 15, he was married to Eleanor of Castile, a political union arranged by his father. What no one expected was how deep the bond between Edward and Eleanor would become. She traveled with him everywhere, even into dangerous territories, standing beside him through every battle, every rebellion, every triumph. Their partnership would become one of the most loyal and enduring royal marriages in British history. But even love could not shield Edward from the coming chaos. When Edward turned 21, the kingdom finally exploded into civil war. The Second Barons' War, led by Simon de Montfort. The rebels were determined to break the power of the monarchy once and for all. Many predicted Henry III would lose everything. But Edward, now a towering warrior with unmatched determination, refused to let his family collapse. Edward threw himself into the conflict with blazing energy. He rode across the countryside, raising supporters, confronting rebels, and rallying scattered royalists. His leadership, courage, and bold strategies marked him as the opposite of his father. Even experienced soldiers followed him with admiration. To the making of a warrior king, Edward's rise to power. Edward's childhood was forged in the shadow of war. Born in 1239 to King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, he entered a world where England was fragile, nobles were restless, and the crown's authority was constantly tested. From the beginning, Edward was not raised as a pampered princey, was shaped as a future warrior. Tall, strong, and fiercely intelligent, young Edward trained with swords before he could read Latin. His tutors drilled him in strategy, chivalry, and the harsh realities of medieval kingship. He learned that a king's crown was not simply worn, it was defended, often with blood. And in a kingdom divided by rebellious barons, Edward understood early that his father's reign was teetering on the edge of collapse. As he grew older, Edward traveled across Europe, witnessing grand courts, military advances, and political tensions that would later influence his brutal yet effective ruling style. His marriage to Eleanor of Castile was not only a political alliance, it became one of the rare royal marriages built on deep affection. Eleanor accompanied him to battlefields, councils, and long campaigns, shaping Edward's emotional and political life in ways few queens ever achieved. But England's peace was shattering. Barons, led by Simon de Montfort, rose in open rebellion against Henry III's mismanagement. Princes often stood safely behind palace walls, but Edward made a different choice. He rode into the heart of the conflict. At first, he clashed fiercely with the rebels, but after moments of hesitation and complex politics, he temporarily aligned with them, seeking reform and stability. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could have cost him his future crown. The turning point came at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. Edward's bold cavalry charged nearly secured victory, but his rash pursuit allowed the rebels to trap the king's forces. Edward fled the battlefield to fight another day, but the sting of defeat left a mark he would never forget. Imprisoned temporarily by the rebels, Edward ultimately escaped through cunning and loyal allies. When he regrouped, he rose with fiery determination. At the Battle of Evesham, Edward crushed de Montfort's forces in a brutal, decisive victory. De Montfort's body was mutilated, signaling a ruthless new chapter in Edward's rise to power. This was the moment England realized the prince was no longer a boy, he was a warrior destined to rule. 3. The road to conquest. Destiny across the Channel. William's childhood lessons in survival shaped him into a ruler who trusted strength above all. By the time he reached adulthood, Normandy was firmly under his control, but England, across the narrow waters of the Channel, was beginning to stir with uncertainty. King Edward the Confessor sat on the English throne, old and childless, and rumors spread like wildfire. Who would inherit England? Who would claim the ancient crown of Albion? William believed he knew the answer. He had met Edward years before, during a diplomatic visit, and Edward had hinted quietly, almost shyly, that William might one day succeed him. To William, this was not a suggestion, it was destiny. His advisors warned him that English nobles would resist a foreign ruler, but William saw only opportunity. He began strengthening his armies, improving cavalry tactics, and forging alliances with the church, which saw him as a disciplined, God-fearing leader. In England, however, a new player was rising. Harold, a powerful noble who commanded armies and held the respect of most English lords. Harold's influence grew quickly, too quickly for William's liking. Yet William remained patient. He watched as England turned into a land of factions and ambitions, its future unraveling before his eyes. Then came the turning point. William claimed Harold visited Normandy and swore an oath, pledging support for William's right to the English throne. Later, Harold denied it, saying the oath had been made under pressure. But to William, a sworn oath was sacred, unbreakable, and Harold's betrayal ignited a fire inside him that nothing could extinguish. Edward the Confessor died shortly after, and Harold was crowned king within hours. News reached Normandy like a thunderbolt. William did not speak for several moments. His face did not change, but the entire court felt the air shift. At last, he said quietly, "Harold has taken what is mine." From that moment, William's purpose sharpened into something fierce and immovable. He sent envoys across Europe, gathering support, obtaining the Pope's blessing, and building one of the most formidable invasion fleets the medieval world had ever seen. Every sword, every ship, every knight was a piece of the destiny he had been fighting for since childhood. As the winds over the Channel howled and storms delayed his departure, William waited not with fear but with certainty. The crown of England was not simply a prize. It was the final step toward securing his bloodline, proving his right to rule, and reshaping the fate of Albion itself. War was coming, and William was ready. For the siege of a kingdom, Edward III's fight for survival. War had followed Edward III for so long that it became part of his very identity. By the time he reached mid-reign, the crown was heavier than ever before. England was bleeding wealth. France resisted every advance, and enemies inside the realm whispered doubts about the king who dared to challenge an empire. But Edward was no ruler of hesitation. He was a commander forged in fire. The turning point came when France attempted to reclaim lost territory and crush Edward's expanding influence. Armies gathered, alliances wavered, and Europe braced for another brutal chapter of the 100 Years' War. Edward answered with strategy rather than fear, summoning his greatest military minds and reorganizing England's scattered defenses. The king relied heavily on his longbowmen, whose skill had already stunned Europe. He believed that discipline, speed, and unity not. Brute force would carry England to victory. As French forces advanced, Edward positioned his troops with surgical precision, choosing battlegrounds that favored terrain rather than numbers. But war was not his only challenge. Plague swept across England like a shadow of death, emptying villages and shrinking the workforce. The Black Death did not care for royal titles or noble bloodlines. It stole laborers, soldiers, and farmers, pushing the kingdom toward economic collapse. Through it all, Edward refused to bend. He restructured wages, stabilized grain supply, and reinforced royal authority to maintain order during chaos. Yet even kings feel loss. Edward watched friends, advisors, and loyal soldiers fall victim to disease. The crown's inner court grew quieter, its laughter replaced by the silence of mourning. The burden of survival made him colder, more calculating, driven by the belief that England must rise stronger or perish entirely. As the war raged, Edward reinforced England's naval power, building fleets capable of controlling the Channel and blocking French reinforcements. The English navy became a weapon as vital as the sword, and Edward used it brilliantly, turning the sea into a fortress that protected the homeland. Victories came slowly but decisively. French morale cracked. English forces pushed deeper into contested territories, and Edward's name whispered through Europe like a coming storm. For the first time in generations, England stood poised not just to defend itself but to reshape the map of Europe. Yet every triumph added new enemies. Every victory demanded more men, more gold, more sacrifice. Edward knew that kingdoms were not built solely on courage, they were built on the blood of thousands, and he carried that weight with the solemn pride of a king determined to secure England's destiny. 5. The Hammer Falls. Edward's final wars and fading strength as Edward I entered the final decade of his reign. The fire that had pushed him through battles, rebellions, and crusades still burned yet. The weight of age pressed heavily on him. His victories over Wales had strengthened the English crown, but Scotland remained a storm he could never calm. Each year brought new uprisings, new leaders, and new promises of independence that threatened everything he had built. Edward had defeated many Scottish nobles, imprisoned rivals, and taken Scotland's crown jewels. Yet the resistance did not end. After William Wallace's execution, Edward believed Scotland was finally broken. But another leader rose Robert de Bruce, a man far more patient, strategic, and relentless than Wallace. Bruce did not fight like a traditional knight. He struck swiftly, avoided large battles, and slowly reclaimed castles one by one. His tactics frustrated Edward, who relied on massive armies and direct confrontation. The king grew older, his body stiff from years of war, but his determination hardened. He viewed Scotland not simply as rebellion, but as betrayal and insult to the authority he believed God had given him. Advisors begged him to rest, but Edward refused. He would lead one final campaign north, even if it drained to the last of his strength. By now, his court was filled with tension. Nobles were tired of endless war, finances were strained, and the people suffered under heavy taxation. Even Edward's relationship with his son, the future Edward II, was collapsing. He feared his son was too weak, too distracted, too easily influenced to maintain the empire he intended to leave behind. Despite all this, Edward prepared for another invasion of Scotland. He traveled north slowly, carried more by rage than by strength. His men could see he was failing. Nights brought fever. Days brought pain. But whenever they suggested turning back, he snapped at them. "My body may fail, but my will does not." In 1307, as his army reached the border, the king's strength finally gave way. He collapsed at Berg by Sands, his armor too heavy for the body that once led crusades. His commanders rushed to him, but Edward knew the truce's campaign was over. His greatest ambition, the complete subjugation of Scotland, had slipped from his grasp. Even in his final hours, he issued commands. His son should continue the war. His bones should be carried at the front of the army, so that even in death he could strike fear into the Scots. Whether these wishes were obeyed remains uncertain, but they revealed the depth of his obsession. Conquest had become his identity. Edward I died on July 7, 1307. News spread quickly across England, and his people mourned a king who brought order, law, and a powerful monarchy. But in Scotland, his death was met with relief. His shadow had finally lifted. The great warrior king, feared across Europe, left behind an unfinished war, a fractured family, and a legacy defined as much by ambition as by achievement. His reign reshaped Britain, but the empire he imagined was still years away from being fully realized. 6. Securing the crown. Rebellions, betrayals, and an unforgiving king. Nobicientos' words, winning the Battle of Hastings, was only the beginning. When William placed the English crown on his head in 1066, he knew the real war was yet to come. Conquering a kingdom was one thing, keeping it was far harder. England rebelled again and again, refusing to submit to a foreign ruler. For William, every sunrise meant another uprising to crush, another noble to discipline, and another threat to the fragile unity he was desperate to create. In the first years of his reign, the north of England became the heart of resistance. Local lords refused to accept Norman rule, and whispers of rebellion spread from villages to fortresses. William moved with swift brutality. Riding across the countryside with his armies, he burned entire regions that opposed him, destroying crops, homes, and livestock. This devastating campaign, known as the Harrying of the North, left thousands dead and the land barren for years. To William, it was a necessary cruelty. To the English people, it was a tragedy they would remember for generations. But even after the North was subdued, new threats appeared. Foreign powers saw England as unstable under Norman rule, and many believed they could steal the crown from William. From Denmark came a massive fleet-threatening invasion. William prepared his defenses with strategic brilliance, reinforcing coastal fortifications, gathering troops, and using the rough English winter to his advantage. The Danish fleet eventually withdrew, unable to secure a foothold. Inside England, rebellions continued to simmer. Powerful English earls plotted William's downfall, hoping to restore native rule. Yet William proved relentless. His spies infiltrated noble households, gathering secrets and exposing conspiracies before they sparked into war. When traitors were discovered, he stripped them of lands and titles, granting these rewards to loyal Norman knights. Slowly, the English aristocracy was replaced with a Norman elite, who owed everything to William. But even among his own supporters, William found treacherous ambition. Some Norman nobles, thinking themselves untouchable, waged private wars, seized land unlawfully, or challenged William's authority. He responded with an iron hand. Though they had fought beside him at Hastings, William did not hesitate to punish them. For him, loyalty to the crown was absolute, not a matter of friendship or shared blood. Despite his stern rule, William was not heartless. He understood the need to build rather than simply destroy. Castles rose across England, massive stone fortresses that became the backbone of Norman power. The Tower of London, one of his greatest projects, symbolized not only military might, but also the reshaping of England under his vision. William also reshaped England's governance. He introduced Norman law and reorganized the land system so that every estate ultimately belonged to the king. This change ensured that nobles could never challenge him without risking everything. Yet his greatest administrative achievement was the creation of the Domesday Book. In 1085, he ordered a vast survey of every piece of land, every village, every farm animal, every household in England. It was an unprecedented act of royal control, a detailed record of the kingdom's wealth, allowing William to tax with precision and assert authority in every corner of the land. The English called it the Book of Judgment, because no one could dispute what was written inside. Still, beneath the victories and reforms, William faced personal struggles. His marriage to Matilda remained loving, but political responsibilities often kept them apart. His children grew restless, especially his eldest son, Robert, who felt William did not respect him as a future ruler. This tension would soon erupt into a painful family conflict. By the late 1070s, William had secured his crown, but at a heavy cost. England was now under firm Norman rule, yet resentment lingered like smoke after a long battle. William believed he had brought strength and order to a divided land, but he also knew he had ruled with fear as much as loyalty. Still, in his mind, every action had been necessary. A king who hesitated would lose everything. A king who showed weakness would be destroyed. William carried this belief like a shield, even as enemies, foreign, English, and even within his own family waited for the perfect moment to strike. And soon they would. 7. The Unbreakable Crown. Edward I's final campaigns, and the weight of power. As Edward I entered the final decade of his reign, the king who once strode across battlefields like an unstoppable force began to feel the long shadow of age. Yet his ambitions did not weaken. If anything, they sharpened. He had conquered Wales, reshaped England's laws, and brought rebellious nobles to heel about Scotland, remained the one kingdom he could not fully bend to his will. After the death of his wife, Eleanor of Castile, Edward's grief hardened into determination. He poured his sorrow into war, believing that securing Britain under one crown would cement both his legacy and the future of the English monarchy. But Scotland was no quiet opponent. With William Wallace rising as a symbol of freedom, rebellion spread across the Highlands and Lowlands like wildfire. Edward launched multiple campaigns, each more brutal than the last. Castles were besieged, villages burned, and alliances forced through intimidation or sheer exhaustion. Yet every victory was met with another uprising. Wallace's capture and execution did not break Scotland's resolve, only ignited a fiercer resistance. Despite failing health, Edward marched north once again, determined to crush Robert the Bruce, the new heart of Scottish defiance. But the king, who once rode with the strength of a warrior, now struggled with the weight of armor. His bones ached, his breath shortened, and even the loyal soldiers who once saw him as invincible now whispered of the king's decline. Edward pushed himself beyond reason. He slept in armor. He refused to turn back. He believed a final victory would secure the unity of the island forever. But fate intervened. In 1307, before he could cross into Scotland, Edward collapsed and died on the march, still grasping his sword, still dreaming of a united Britain. His commanders mourned the loss of a king who had reshaped their world, but his final wish to have his bones carried into Scotland to inspire victory was never fulfilled. His son, Edward II, lacked his father's discipline, strength, and vision, and the empire Edward I built on determination and war soon began to weaken. Yet even in failure, Edward I's final campaigns left a lasting mark. His unyielding pursuit of unity planted the seeds for future monarchs who would eventually achieve what he could not. His life became a symbol of the brutal cost of forging a kingdom one built not only through battles, but through laws, castles, and unbreakable will. 8. The Final Reckoning. Legacy born from fire. As William entered the final years of his reign, the kingdom he had forged through steel, fire, and relentless ambition stood both triumphant and trembling. England was no longer the fractured land he had conquered in 1066. It was unified under Norman rule, reshaped by new laws, new hierarchies, and a new vision of monarchy. But power, as William had always known, came with a cost. His victories had carved deep wounds across the land, and even deeper scars within his own bloodline. His sons, Robert, William Rufus, and Henry, each carried their father's strength, but none of his discipline. Arguments erupted frequently, driven by ambition and jealousy. Robert rebelled openly, demanding Normandy as his inheritance. William, aging and burdened, realized that the greatest war he ever faced was not with England's rebels or foreign kings, but with the very heirs meant to secure his legacy. In these last years, William traveled endlessly across his domains, reinforcing loyalty, quelling unrest, and ensuring the system he built would not collapse. His greatest administrative achievement, the Doomsday Book, was completed, a monumental record of every land, household, and ownership in England. It was a tool of taxation, but to William it was something far greater, a blueprint for a stable kingdom that would outlast him. Yet even a conqueror could not escape fate. During a campaign in France, William suffered a severe injury when his horse reared and crushed him against a saddle pump. The wound grew infected, and the mighty king who had survived rebellions, invasions, and decades of war grew weak. In his final moments, he reflected on the life he had shaped through force and fire. The battles fought, the land transformed, and the crown secured at unimaginable cost. On September 9th, 1087, William the Conqueror died. His funeral was chaotic, disrupted by fires, disputes, and collapsing crowds, a symbol of the turbulent reign that had defined him. But despite the turmoil surrounding his death, the kingdom he forged endured. His sons divided his empire. Robert inherited Normandy. William Rufus took England. Henry, the youngest, awaited his moment and would one day seize the throne and reshape the monarchy anew. William's reign had been forged in blood and conquest, but its impact was undeniable. He had built not merely a kingdom, but a New England, one bound together by law, land, and a monarchy powerful enough to influence centuries of rulers. The conqueror was gone, but the world he created had only just begun.